Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a fascinating and honestly incredibly timely topic. We're unpacking an article by Jake Lundberg about Fergus M. Bordowich's book, Centennial, The Great Fair of 1876 and the Invention of America's Future. So picture this. America is throwing itself a massive 100th birthday party. It is this dazzling event showing off unbelievable material progress. But, as we're going to see, literally just outside the gates of this giant celebration, the nation was seething. I'm talking violence, corruption, and a super fragile democracy. The parallels to where we are right now are striking, so let's jump right in. To really get the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia, you have to understand the sheer, overwhelming awe it inspired in people. Take this letter from a young woman from Providence, Rhode Island. She literally ran out of words, just a string of O's. And honestly, you can't blame her. Visitors were walking into a 21-acre main building, which was, at the time, the largest man-made structure on the entire planet. Even Alexander Graham Bell, who was there to show off his brand new invention, the telephone, said the whole thing just absolutely staggered him. Section 1. The Spectacle of 1876. Inside the Gates of the Great Fair. Okay, let's dive into this. If you were wandering through this massive fair, you might have noticed a contrast that perfectly captured the transformation America was going through. The editor of The Atlantic sure did. On one hand, you had a wooden spinning wheel operated by a reenactor dressed up as a Mayflower pilgrim. Very nostalgic, right? A symbol of colonial manual labor. But then, right nearby, the Corliss steam engine. This thing was a 30-foot, 122,000-pound cast-iron marvel of the future. It operated almost silently, driven purely by steam, and it only needed a single attendant to just occasionally add a drop of oil. It's a brilliant metaphor, really. America was eagerly trading those quaint relics of the past for this bold, highly industrialized future. And the crowds were unbelievable. 9,799,392 visitors, to be exact. To put that massive number into perspective, that was roughly 20% of the entire U.S. population in 1876. 20%? People traveled from all over the country. There was actually a 79-year-old man who walked all the way from Indiana just to see it. The whole fair was this perfect Gilded Age confection, heavily bankrolled and maneuvered by railroad bosses to create a giant, phantasmagorical theater of national glory. Which brings us to Section 2, the cost of industrialization and the reality outside the gates. Now, here's the catch. While the fair celebrated the absolute genius of the people designing these machines, it completely glossed over the brutal drudgery of the people actually doing the grunt work. Listen to this chilling report from an Andrew Carnegie plant manager over in Pittsburgh. A young worker, a hoist boy, is crushed to a jelly by a broken rope. And the immediate response from management? They blame the boy for his own carelessness and casually complain that the accident delayed work slightly. I mean, wow. This was the dark reality of industrial wage labor back then. It was dirty, it was incredibly dangerous, and human life was treated as entirely disposable. And if those workers tried to stand up and organize, the pushback was swift and brutal. Just 100 miles away from all that celebrating in Philadelphia, Irish coal miners in Schuylkill County had gone on strike. In response, the Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Company basically became the law. Using a private police force, the company's president actually took on the powers of a district attorney. He personally prosecuted the labor activists. The end result of these show trials? 20 miners were sent to the gallows. It is a stark example of how corporate power could just totally crush labor organizing using lethal force. Section 3. The Native American Reality and the Illusion of Vanishing. You see, the fair carefully curated exactly who was included and how they were presented. For Native Americans, the Smithsonian gathered artifacts and displayed them essentially as primitive cultures. This was incredibly calculated. It was designed to make the mechanical, industrial present look even more marvelous by contrast, painting Native Americans as this naturally vanishing people. But outside the exhibition, that vanishing wasn't a natural phenomenon at all. As Indian Affairs Commissioner Francis A. Walker blatantly put it in 1873, Native Americans were viewed as an obstacle to the national progress. So the actual government policy was active coercion onto reservations or just outright war. When you track the events of that summer, it is just this absolute chaotic whiplash. The fair opens in May. On July 4th, Philadelphia throws these triumphant national celebrations. But literally 3 days later, on July 7th, shockwaves hit the fairground. News arrives that Lakota forces had completely routed General George Custer at the Little Bighorn, killing him and over 260 of his men. The irony is just staggering here, because Custer had actually been at the Centennial Exhibition just weeks prior, predicting that civilization would roll mercilessly over the Plains Indians. And then, as if the week couldn't get any darker, the very next day, July 8th, horrific racial violence erupts down in South Carolina. Which brings us to Section 4, the collapse of Reconstruction and the false promise of reconciliation. Now, what's really interesting about this is the deeply disturbing contrast regarding Black Americans in 1876. Inside the fair, one of the only places Black workers were employed was at this attraction called the Restaurant of the South. It was run by a white businessman and featured staff playing the roles of enslaved people, strumming banjos and singing melodies. It was essentially a northern fetishization of Southern slavery. But outside the fair, the reality was the Hamburg Massacre, a violent, highly organized campaign by white mobs in South Carolina to murder Black citizens and strip away their political rights. So the fair was staging this symbolic, happy reconciliation between white Northerners and Southerners while completely abandoning the promises made to Black Americans after the Civil War. Let's look a little closer at what actually happened in Hamburg. It kicked off on July 4th when two white men confronted a Black militia marching in a parade. 4 days later, those men came back. But this time, they brought a mob and, literally, a cannon. They shelled the building where the militiamen were sheltering and ultimately murdered 6 Black men, including cutting out the tongue of the town's Black marshal. This wasn't just some random riot. It was a calculated and sadly successful campaign to violently oust the Republican government and effectively end Reconstruction in the state. Section 5, a constitutional crisis, looking at the election of 1876. Right as the fair was wrapping up, the 1876 presidential election turned into an unbelievably tangled mess. Democrat Samuel J. Tilden actually won the popular vote against Republican Rutherford B. Hayes. But the Electoral College? Total dispute. There was rampant fraud and violence in Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana. Florida somehow ended up with 3 completely separate vote counts. South Carolina had 2 rival legislatures and governors facing off, heavily armed. The nation was literally teetering on the edge of a second civil war. So how do you solve a crisis where the democratic machinery has completely broken down? Well, not through the voters, that's for sure. Congress set up a special electoral commission, but it instantly gridlocked along strict partisan lines. The resolution ultimately came through a shadowy, backroom political compromise. The Democrats agreed to accept Hayes as president. In exchange, Hayes agreed to pull the last remaining federal troops out of the South. And with that single stroke of a pen, Reconstruction came to an official close, leaving Black Americans entirely unprotected against the violent redemption campaigns we were just talking about. Finally, Section 6, Echoes in Modern America, approaching the 250th anniversary. This brings us right to the present day. As the source material highlights, the debates of 1876 feel incredibly familiar when you look at the cultural conversations we're having as we approach America's 250th anniversary. You can clearly see the 2 sides of this ongoing tension today. On one side, you have efforts like President Trump's 2025 executive order, which aims to restore truth and sanity to American history by focusing on recovering the nation's material and founding glory. On the flip side, you have the modern historical movement, which for decades has focused heavily on reckoning with the legacies of conquest, racism, and democratic fragility. The tension between celebrating that grand glory and grappling with the deep shame, it is exactly the same today as it was a century and a half ago. Right before the 1876 fair closed its doors, a Massachusetts man published a poem about the Hamburg Massacre. He wrote, "I sound no paeans of valor and fame. My song is shadowed by strains of sadness. I tell the tale of the nation's shame." It just perfectly encapsulates the duality of the American experience. In a year defined by the mind-blowing, awe-inspiring Corliss steam engine, it was also defined by crushed laborers, broken treaties, and horrific racial violence. Which leaves us with one final profound question. As America approaches its 250th birthday, how will we choose to make sense of the glory and the shame? The soundness of our democratic machinery is, once again, being tested. We're once again wondering what new massive technological leaps mean for the future of work, and race remains a profound source of debate. It's really up to us to listen to the echoes of 1876. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope this deep dive into the Gilded Age paradox gave you a lot to think about. Until next time, keep learning and stay curious.